Welcome you here to this panel discussion, Remember the Past, Imagine the Future. We're very excited, and we will begin with remarks by our Hobart and William Smith President, Mark Guerin.
Good evening. Thank you, Reverend Bird, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am very honored to be here, and first and foremost, I'm very grateful to Nita for her deep preparation and thought with Dean Brophy on tonight's event and our colleagues across the colleges. Thank you most sincerely for the leadership you brought to this event and what you bring each and every day to our campus. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. To the members of the faculty that are here, thank you for joining us, our staff colleagues, Dean Kenzig, and certainly our student leaders from across Hobart and William Smith, but on this occasion, certainly the Orange Key, Chimera, and Druid members. I thank you for your leadership and what you bring to Hobart and William Smith with your leadership. Tonight's an important night because we have the great privilege with our distinguished panel, who will be introduced formally by Matthew, but a chance to cross disciplines, something that has been a hallmark and a through line at Hobart and William Smith in our curriculum for many decades, but the chance to engage across the disciplines of history and philosophy and theology in this very interesting topic and title for tonight's convening, to remember the past and imagine the future. And with that conversation and that interdisciplinary focus informed by our panelists and the questions that will animate this evening, I'm very confident that as we go into full drive with our bicentennial celebrations of 200 years, we'll have the chance to, as our convening title allows, to remember the past and, importantly, to imagine the future. From my perspective as president of Hobart and William Smith, it's certainly the case, and we have all seen this in other contexts, but institutions can and do change with the attitudes of people inside those organizations. They evolve, and evolve thoughtfully, hopefully, in important ways. And you look at our history of Hobart and William Smith, but certainly Hobart over 200 years, it has evolved, it has changed. From a medical college to its coordinate engagement with William Smith College, founded at a time when this was the very frontier of the western part of the United States, to now a thriving center for tourism and hospitality and the wine industry and the like. But it's also evolved in many interesting ways from a college defined by its enrollment, historically of privilege, of those white men that entered here to the college, from what would be considered elite backgrounds of that time, and evolved wonderfully to this moment where we now have the good fortune to bring and attract students to Hobart and William Smith from all backgrounds, regardless of their gender or race or ethnicity or economic status. And it's also the case in the second part of this title, as we remember this past, that will be analyzed and reflected upon and with your informed questions, but to imagine the future as well, because much remains to be done at Hobart and William Smith as we seek to live up to and personify and reach our highest aspiration of the ideals that we set. So by, I believe, understanding our path, our past, to remember our past in good faith, in transparency, with candor and honesty about our path, we can more meaningfully and substantively imagine our future. It will be better informed, it'll be more honest and more thoughtfully articulated with the discussion that we have here. As the seal of Hobart allows, disce, the Latin, to discuss. And that is at the heart of this college and these colleges. And I'm privileged to stand before you as president of Hobart and William Smith on this bicentennial year. And I'm grateful for the engagement tonight. Thank you and welcome. Thank you.
We now welcome Matthew Messina, a member of the Camera Honor Society in class of 2024.
My name is Matthew Messina, and I am a member of the Camera Honor Society, and I'm going to introduce our panelists tonight. We have the Right Reverend R. William Franklin, who's the Assisting Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Long Island, a member of the teaching faculty of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary in New York, and the former Bishop of the Diocese of Western New York. He holds a Ph.D. in Church History from Harvard University and is Dean Emeritus of the Berkeley Divinity School at Yale University. He was appointed by the Most Reverend Presiding Bishop Michael B. Curry, a Hobart alumnus, class of 1975, to the Theology Committee of the House of Bishops, who published Realizing Beloved Community, Addressing Reparations and the Doctrine of Discovery. The Very Reverend Kelly Brown Douglas is the Canon Theologian at the Washington National Cathedral and the Theologian in Residence at Trinity Church, Wall Street. She is the Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School and Bill and Judith Moyer's Chair in Theology at the Union Theological Seminary. Douglas holds a Bachelor of Science degree from Denison University and Master's and Doctorate degrees from the Union Theological Seminary. Her academic area of focus is womanist theology, sexuality, and the Black church, and racial and social justice. She has been widely published nationally and internationally, and her most recent publication was in 2021, Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter. Dean Scott Brophy is a Hobart alumnus, class of 1978. He is the 16th Dean of Hobart College and also a professor of philosophy. He holds a Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Rochester, and his academic area of focus is the history of philosophy and public policy. He has taught at Hobart College for over 40 years and was the first recipient of the Foster P. Boswell Award, Hobart class of 1901, and professor of philosophy, and given for general excellence in philosophy. The Reverend Nita Johnson Bird will serve as our moderator for the evening. She's the Dean of Spiritual Engagement and Chaplain of Hobart and William Smith Colleges. She holds a Master of Divinity degree from Duke University and a Master of Science degree from North Carolina State University.
Good. Thank you, Matthew. And I want to welcome our community members and guests here this evening. I see several members of the clergy, and I also want to welcome a special guest here, Bishop Steve Lane, who is our Bishop Provisional for the Diocese of Rochester. This evening, we are here to explore the vision that Bishop Hobart established here and that informs what we do here every day at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, and see how that trajectory has placed us in the position where we are now. And you may be surprised at some things you hear this evening. There are complex nuances to the way Bishop Hobart navigated the 19th century. And we will begin by looking at some of that historical content with Bishop Bill Franklin, and move on to Dean Scott Brophy, who will have a perspective with his experience here for over 40 years. And then we'll move on to Dean Kelly Brown Douglas, who will help us integrate a lot of this material and really move us into this piece where we imagine the future. So I would like to begin with turning over the microphone to Bishop Bill Franklin, who has done tremendous research for us here on the history of Bishop Hobart.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Nita Bird, and it's an honor to be on this panel with Dean Kelly Brown Douglas and also Dean Scott Brophy. So I'm surrounded by deans. Somebody help me out in this situation. I hope I get out of it. Anyway, it's a wonderful thing to be here, to have worked with the college and many of you for almost a year on thinking through Bishop Hobart, and it's a challenging task to talk about him tonight. He's certainly a major figure in the Episcopal Church. In fact, today happens to be his feast day in our church. Today is the day 192 years ago he froze to death on a visitation to one of our parishes. I shouldn't be laughing about this, but the bishop will laugh at this because we go on these visitations all the time, and somebody put him in a room on this date where it was so cold. Must have been a sort of who knew why it got so cold that day. but he froze to death. So anyway, that was his end. But without him, without Hobart, most of us would not be Episcopalians, and I don't think there would be a Hobart College. We wouldn't be sitting here today without his great work. Yet he is a complicated personality, and it's a complicated story, and I have about 12 minutes to talk about it, so I'll try to introduce you to it. This 200th anniversary of the college is a great time to look at a figure from the 19th century. I mean, we're in a time when what we're doing tonight might be called woke, or that we're involved in cancel culture. But I think what we're trying to do is what colleges do. We're engaging in scholarship, a conversation together about the good, the bad, and ugly, about someone, I think, who was one of the greatest figures in the Episcopal Church in the 19th century. And I have to say, and I think Scott and Nita know this, when I came into this project, I was very negative about Hobart. And I came out of it really appreciating him. While I understand the negativities very, very much, I changed my point of view. Who was Hobart? Well, if you've seen the musical Hamilton, that is about the time that Hobart was living. He was born in Philadelphia in 1775, so he really grew up in the heart of where the revolution was happening in our country. And he was an ambitious guy, and by 1811, when he was very young, he was both one of the bishops of the whole state of New York. He was also the rector of Trinity Church, Wall Street in New York, where Hamilton was his parishioner for a while. So Hobart had to deal with the time when Hamilton was shot to death. Next time you go to New York, I hope you will go and see the monument to Hobart there. If you go there and you say to the guards, "Oh, I'd like to see Hobart," they'll say, "Who is that?" But then if you say, "I want to see Hamilton," they'll immediately show you where Hamilton is, and there'll be a big line over there. But if you go down the aisle next to the altar, there is a great statue of Hobart, and he is engulfed in the arms of this beautiful woman representing faith, okay? So that's Hobart's place where he's buried, and underneath the altar of Trinity Church is where his body is. And on 9/11, his body was shaken by the falling towers. His tomb was actually wrecked by the falling towers, by the jar of the Twin Towers. So isn't it interesting that yesterday was September 11th when we honored that day. This is the day we honor his freezing to death up in Albert, New York. But he became the Bishop of New York at a very difficult time for the Episcopal Church. We had been on the wrong side of the American Revolution. The Episcopal Church was the Church of England. And in New York State, it was the state church in New York. Therefore, the American people didn't think much of the Episcopal Church. And also, we only had 15,000 members total in the whole United States in 1800. And we had lost most of our clergy. We didn't have much money left from the Church of England. Trinity Wall Street had a lot of money, but just about nobody else had any money. So what would happen with this denomination, the Episcopal Church? We were faced by a mighty surge of evangelical Christianity, the so-called Second Great Awakening of the evangelical movement dominating certainly this part of New York State. This was called the burnt over region. It was called the burnt over region because there were all these revivals going on all the time. People were flocking to the Methodist Church. People were flocking to the Baptist Church. And the evangelicals believed that to be a Christian, in Christian language, to be saved, you had to have a conversion experience. You couldn't get in unless you said, "Oh, at this moment, at this absolute moment, I felt that Jesus came into my heart and I had this sense of my life was changed." If you couldn't do that, they didn't want you to be in that church. And they had worship that focused on preaching primarily, fairly austere looking churches. And they wanted to have very strict standards of moral behavior. For example, no dancing. And also, in a wine growing region, no booze. Okay, so this was a strong movement carrying people forward. Hobart was determined to create a church that would be a bulwark against this movement. I'm just saying this. I hope this doesn't go out too far. I'm not being anti-ecumenical, but just as the Episcopal Church stood for a different way of being a Christian, in which you didn't have to have a conversion experience. You could embrace science. You could embrace culture. And also, he wanted to invite all of the population into the church. And he worked with his mentor, Bishop William White of Philadelphia, to really define the nature of authority in the Episcopal Church. And this is very important to me, and why I wrote an article for your alumni magazine entitled We the People. The Church of England was a church in which the monarch appointed the bishop, right? The absolute authority over the church and in appointing officials in the church was of the monarch. You know, the queen has died, there's a new king. On the first day in office, he met with all the previous prime ministers, and he also met with the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Church of England. I thought, why in the hell wait, I shouldn't say this. Why is he doing this? And he's doing it because the king is still the head of the Church of England. Charles is now the head of the Church of England. Hobart believed that for the Episcopal Church to survive, we had to say that the people govern this church. In fact, they do. Bishops, both of us, were elected by the people. The rector, Cam Miller, who's here, was elected by the vestry of his congregation to come and serve in his church. And so this was what Hobart was trying to say. This is an American form of Christianity, which welcomes all. You don't have to have a conversion experience, which welcomes modern culture, science, and also was reaching out to all sectors of the population. He was the bishop of the whole state. He spent month after month traveling up and down this state on horseback, in carriages, on the Erie Canal. Imagine old Hobart out there on the Erie Canal going and founding churches all up and down here along the canal, trying to invite people into this church as a way of having this broader, more humanistic way of being a Christian. And he believed that it was a church not just for New York elites in New York City, but for everybody in this region. And so he founded a college, this college, which would train leaders from small towns around this entire region in this way of being a Christian leader. People who were not just urban elites, but farmers, mechanics, engineers, lawyers, physicians, politicians, who would be students of Christian humanism. And he used that term Christian humanism on purpose, saying this form of Christianity welcomed the culture of the past and wanted to bring that culture to the frontier. That was exactly what he founded this to be the mission of this college, and to reach out of populations who had not been brought into the churches. So he reached out to the Native American indigenous population of the region. He licensed Eleazar Williams, a candidate for holy orders in the church, as a lay reader who would bring the Oneida Indians and Native Americans into the Episcopal Church. He founded at Oneida Castle a native congregation. He had the Book of Common Prayer, our prayer book, translated into the language of the Native Americans, the Oneida. But also he ordained the first Black priest in the Episcopal Church in New York State. He consecrated the first Black church, St. Philip's Church, one of the great American churches. But, and yet, he was strikingly insensitive to the challenges of minorities in the new nation. He turned his back on the growing abolitionist movement, saying that the Episcopal Church should not be involved in secular politics. Now, let me say a word about this. Why did he believe that? Because he did not want us to be like the Church of England. What was the Church of England? It was a state church. Its prime minister, the Prime Minister of England, was deeply involved, as well as the monarch, Queen Victoria, in running the state church. He said, we don't want to be like that. The evangelicals said, we want to be running the country. Have you heard that before? You've heard about some evangelicals wanting to do that today. That was also going on in Hobart's time. We've seen what happens with Dobbs in the Supreme Court. Where did that come from? That was a big evangelical movement moving toward that. The same thing was happening in his time. He said, we want to do that. We want to witness by bringing people into our church, but by not trying to shape and govern the United States government. he had a lot of opposition, and my two colleagues are going to come at me about this, I think, in a minute. But one of those people I think they'll talk to you about are the John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. New Yorker, an Episcopalian, his son William Jay and his grandson John Jay II were ardent abolitionists, and they deeply criticized Hobart publicly for this stand, for what he did. And they went for the abolition of slavery. And they said, you're betraying your call by not doing that. Happens that one little piece I will share is they had slaves they owned, that family, and they earned their money in the slave trade. Hobart didn't. And they liked a lot of things about what Hobart did, but they did not think he was right. Of course, we don't either, on his stand on slavery, or the church not being involved in politics. Peter Williams, the black priest he ordained, he would not let him go and study at General Seminary. He said, that's only for white people. And he would not let St. Philip's Church send delegates to our governing diocesan convention. Our church is run by a diocesan convention in the state. You can't go. He had a segregated form of government. The black church had to stay over in its church and not get out and mix with those who were members of the white congregations. And he did not criticize the transposition of Native Americans from this region to Wisconsin. In fact, his deacon, Eleazar Williams, was an agent of the land companies, taking money for the land companies, cooperating with them to make sure people were shipped out there. So do you see, I'm trying to say that we are facing a complex legacy. This figure that I deeply appreciate because of his image of what our church should be doing. This figure that I'm saying today was so flawed in terms of his attitude toward slavery, his attitude toward Native peoples, and understanding them. What shall we do today? I believe that he planted a seed here at Hobart College of inclusion, despite his flaws, that flowered into a very important fact for our church, that the first black priest elected as presiding bishop, head of our church, Michael Curry, was a graduate of Hobart College. Okay, I do not think that is an accident. And I think that's a fact that you should be deeply proud of this college, as through time, you welcome into the college black students, Native American students, women with the cooperation with William Smith, and queer students. You were the first, I believe, undergraduate college in the country that had a program in queer studies. I think these revolutionary acts, all of them that I've named, were part of that flourishing of something that was in the DNA of this college that came from Hobart and his understanding of we the people as the way a church should be governed, and if I should say, a college should be governed. I don't think actually, as an old professor myself, that the student should actually be running the college, but you know what I'm saying. But that in fact, the embracing of a wide range of students is the way to fulfill what education is meant to be. So I close by saying that I think this institution should be so proud of the fact of what you have stood for in transforming people who've come to this college for 200 years, in raising up leaders who have led not only Western New York and upstate New York, but have led the country. And now one leader who has led our church. I think in a golden age in which he has tried to teach us this doctrine of being a beloved community that welcomes all, that tries to keep all together, and in which, to borrow the line from a song, all you need is love. So that is my praise tonight, I think, of this flawed figure, and actually also of a presiding bishop, that this trajectory has produced to lead our country. So thank you, Hobart College, for allowing Hobart to be your founder and allowing Michael Curry to be our presiding bishop.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bishop Franklin. And I think that this gives us a good context to continue this discussion. It's very interesting. We began this work about a year ago.
We did.
And Dean Brophy, you were the one who began to bring this to my attention of some of the complexities and flaws that we do see in the middle of a person who founded our college and had this vision that led to the type of inclusive space we are. And I think we want to continue to see how can we even do more of this. But I remember you began to mention the conversations with John Jay, and as I researched, my eyes were open. So I'd like to get your input now and some of the things that you're thinking about.
Sure. First, thanks to Bishop Franklin, and I have to say one of the real joys of this bicentennial has been the opportunity to talk about the 19th century with you, and I've truly enjoyed it. And yes, of course, John Jay's point was that if your position is the high church ought not get involved in politics, that functions de facto as an apologia, a defense of the institution of slavery.
That did.
I also have to recommend to all of you the Pulteney Street Survey has a fabulous article by Bishop Franklin summarizing some of the things he just said, and I recommend it to you highly. So here's a question that we all had to confront for the last year. How do we celebrate our founding 200 years ago? I've been teaching the history of philosophy for a pretty long time, and two things I want to point out about the past and about studying the past. One is that we can't take the past entirely on its own terms, uninformed by the present. Doing so leads to a kind of moral relativism that drives philosophers crazy. People living in the past may have believed something to be morally permissible, but their believing so doesn't make it so. We now know that slavery and all sorts of colonizing behavior really is wrong. Objectively speaking, unjust. Here I'm revealing an underlying philosophical belief that injustice really does exist, that slavery is wrong, that proposition that slavery is wrong does not depend on whether it's believed to be wrong by some group at some time. It's our beliefs that have evolved, not whether it was ever unjust to be enslaved. Or, to pick an example closer to home, whether it was right to be moved from one's ancestral homeland because a group of well-intentioned newcomers, okay, with some powerful weapons, believed that relocating my people would save our souls. The second thing about studying the past, while we can't take the past entirely on its own terms, it's also not fair to judge the past entirely by today's standards. Sometimes it requires heroism to be that far ahead of one's times, and sometimes the cost of speaking out can be very dramatic. Co-panelists, I'm thinking of, say, the Third and Fourth Crusades, well, any of the Crusades, you know. Another reason it's not fair to judge the past entirely by today's standards is that it's Philistine to not try to understand the past on its own terms. Perhaps it's anachronistic to import our contemporary standards in morally analyzing the various beliefs of someone living centuries ago. It can lead us to throwing out the baby with the bathwater, to having us cancel people who are not hundreds of years ahead of their time. Okay? Again, that point is just that if we hold people in the past to today's standards, and we understand that some of their beliefs were morally wrong, we don't want to blind ourselves to some of the things that we might want to learn from such people. So while you do want to understand the past a bit on its own terms, there have been feminists since ancient Athens, and there have been abolitionists for centuries throughout modern history, including at the first constitutional convention of what became the United States. Some people at those times knew these things were wrong. The point is that taking the past entirely on its own terms leads to an uncritical relativism of, it was right because they thought it was right. Yet the alternative of judging the past entirely by today's standards can lead to the worst of cancel culture. Now finally to the present and our moment in history. The present is poised between the past and the future, always. We resolve that false dilemma I was just talking about by critically engaging with the past as part of celebrating it. In saying the present is poised between the past and the future, I mean it in ways that are sometimes surprising. It's not just that our past shapes our vision of the future. It's that our vision of the future shapes our pasts. I hesitate to say this with two real theologians on the panel, but I mean this in a way that would be like our eschatology shapes our Genesis. In studying the people and events that have made us, we find stories that deserve to be told with more nuance and accuracy, such as the role of Bishop Hobart and the Episcopal Church in relocating the Oneida. Or someone whose life we recently celebrated on campus, someone who I wish I could somehow get to travel back in time to talk to Bishop Hobart. I'd love to be there for the conversation myself. The Reverend Dr. Alger Adams, class of 1932, became the first African-American graduate of Hobart College some 90 years ago. He was a member of Phi Beta Kappa. He learned ancient Greek and the classics. He became an accomplished painter and also a novelist of some note. Oh, and when not writing fiction or painting, he held down a day job as a clergyman. But as a student, he couldn't eat with his classmates. He couldn't live on campus with a college roommate, all because of the color of his skin. So here is my thesis, I guess, because, I taught philosophy. I always feel like I should have one. Alger Adams and generations of alums in all walks of life, rich in the life of the mind, remind us that the values associated with a liberal arts education that are worth celebrating after 200 years. Investigating these stories in both direct and nuanced ways that matter to us now, in the present, will help us preserve some of those values for the next 200 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Brophy. Those are very insightful remarks. And I think what I'm pulling from some of that is, how do we find a civil way to engage with our past without romanticizing the past and not engaging in this cancel culture? Because we find that we are living in an increasingly polarized society today. And I'd like to move on to Dean Douglas and offer you the platform now for remarks and also to help us flesh some of this out, particularly as it relates to these nuances about Bishop Hobart.
Thank you very much, Reverend Byrd, and thank you for the privilege and honor of being here with you this evening and making space for me to do so via Zoom. It is truly a pleasure to be in conversation with my colleague and friend, Bishop Bill Franklin, and my new colleague, and I hope to have a growing friendship with Dean Brophy. You both have left me with much to comment on so I will make some comments, and I hope that it will stimulate our further conversation. Let me begin with the comment, or by reflecting upon how we are to engage with a complicated past, especially as someone like Bishop Hobart reflects that complicated past and that complicated reality. I want to affirm what Dean Brophy said, and that is that we must engage it critically by engaging in critical dialogue with that past. Now, what does that mean? That means, frankly, we tell the truth. We tell the truth about the past. And this is what we have to recognize as we have come to this place in our country where it seems that if telling the truth creates an uncomfortable space, then we don't tell it. And we've begun to equate being comfortable with civil conversation. And Reverend Byrd, you mentioned this thing about civil conversation. We have to remember that civil conversation should never preclude uncomfortable conversations.
Right.
Because if indeed we are going to move toward a more just future, then we have to learn to live in the uncomfortable places of our present and in our past. And so how do we engage a complicated past? One, by telling the truth. Secondly, as we do that, and I talk about this linearly, but it goes together. As we engage in this critical conversation that should be marked by telling the truth of our complicated history, we have to begin to recognize that the way in which we have told our story as a nation, as a people, has been through the lens of a dominant culture, right? And so that's a part of telling the truth, recognizing that the history we have told and the way we have told it has not been objective. No. And so we have to begin to shift our gaze, shift our vision in how indeed we engage our history, our story. Now, when we are speaking of a complicated history, and I use that in quotes, complicated history, in which our nation, for instance, has had a vision, if you will, for justice, even as it lives into a reality of injustice. And as we engage a history in which our nation may have had a vision, but a circumscribed vision for justice and democracy, even as it was grounded and founded on principles which indeed disqualified certain human beings from citizenship or even being considered human for that matter. Even as it had this vision, how then are we to engage and enter into this history? we must enter into it if we want to understand the movement toward a democracy, the movement toward justice, and what that looks like and what it doesn't look like, what freedom looks like and what it doesn't look like. Then we have to engage that from the perspective of those who've been on the underside of that history, from the perspective of those subjugated histories, from the perspective of those subjugated voices. If we don't do that, then we are never going to understand the full complexity of our history, of our story. Where we find ourselves today is in this place of eliminating those further subjugating, if you will, those voices, because to lift them up, to center those voices in the telling of our story is to create an uncomfortable truth. And so not an uncivil conversation, but an uncomfortable truth. And so we have to be careful never to equate civility with being comfortable. If we're ever going to get to the uncomfortable truth of our story. Also, again, recognizing that we have typically told that story from the perspective of a dominant culture. So we've got to change the gaze. We've got to change our entryway into the history. Now, what does this mean about the church? And so let me now sort of shift. And I loved the way Dean Brophy spoke of the way in which the future also shapes our past and how we read that past and our present. Well, here's the thing about the church, and then this will lead me to the complexity of one like Bishop Hobart. The church, by virtue of claiming to be if you will, a community of faith, the church should always be accountable to the future. Right? So the church's task is to help us to expand our moral imaginary of what justice looks like, holding us accountable to that more just future. The church should never allow itself and its vision to be shaped by the status quo or by the limited, if you will, sort of imaginations of our present. And so in that regard, you see, the church always in some ways is that should be, because I say to call ourselves church is aspirational. We first need to live into that, right? That if we were to be church, we have to live into and move our country, our nation, move us as a people toward this more just future. Right? Expanding our moral imaginary. That's one thing. The other thing this means is that justice, not unity, should be our priority. Unity follows justice. When you talk, Bishop Franklin, about the legacy of one like Bishop Hobart and his wanting to bring people into the church, and a legacy that created the possibility for Hobart, we're to celebrate that, and perhaps created the possibility for our presiding bishop to attend Hobart and to be the presiding bishop in our church. There's another legacy, it seems to me, that he continued forward and that continues in our church. Is something, it's this sort of via media notion that we're proud of, but that via media has come to be translated and come to be synonymous with neutrality.
Right.
There is no neutrality in the face of injustice. Mm-hmm. And so this is where John Jay is right. You can't be silent, as the Episcopal Church was, trying to stay unified, not split like the Methodists and the Baptists, when you've got slavery going on. Right. Because silence is consent. Yeah. Silence is complicity. The Episcopal Church was a little more than complicit. They were the church. Right, so let's be clear about that. I'm going too long. But you can't be, the church must be silent, and those who claim to represent and be church must never be silent in the face of injustice. The church has the moral responsibility, the responsibility of the more just future, to to claim some kind of moral courage to speak into that future, which means to speak truthfully about the present and, yes, truthfully about the past that has led to this unjust present. And so in that regard, and there are always, Dean Brophy, you're right, there have always been the John Jays, there have always been the William Wilberforces, right, that have spoken out, because if we don't have those people, then we can't change. Then there's no hope for a more just future. If we don't have those voices who are not beholden to the institutions of which they're a part, these social institutions, but are beholden to a more just future. And so I will end there. What to say, but have already spoken too long.
No.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Douglas, and thank you, everyone. I want us to really think about this piece of accountable to the future. You were speaking about the church, but I think that that is something that we as an institution need to remember as Hobart William Smith colleges. You know, how do we look at being accountable to the future right now? So part of that is the involvement of our students who have worked, some of them have worked over the past several months and throughout the summer to look at some of this material. And I want to thank members of Orange Key Honor Society, Chimera Honor Society, and the Druid Honor Society who are present with us tonight. And I'm going to call them up here to ask a couple of questions. And because of the sake of time, I think we will have certain of you on the panel address certain questions because we've got some really good ones here and I want to get to them. So I'm going to begin with Jonathan Garcia, a member of the Druids, who will pose our first question. Some of these are questions that students have developed, and some are a combination of the student questions and questions that have been presented by our participants online.
Okay, hi, good evening.
Hello.
And our first question is, what would it have been like if Bishop John Henry Hobart had not established a democratic process in the church, and what was the impact that Bishop Hobart not getting involved in politics had?
So I'm going to ask Bishop Bill,
Okay.
if you will, Bishop Bill, if you will weigh in on that one.
I will, Ray. I think my thought is that the Episcopal Church would have disappeared. It would have maybe been a little cult for very rich folks in New York City who could travel to England and wanted to be able to go around in the Church of England. I think it would not have gone forward. And there are examples of denominations disappearing in the United States. If I could use one very obscure example, the Valdensians, who were Italian Protestants who had survived in Italy, not many, but Italian Protestants immigrated to the United States, and they tried to keep the Valdensian church going, and they couldn't, and it was absorbed by the Presbyterian Church. So that's just one example that I wanted to give you. I don't think there are any, I've tried to find any examples of Valdensian churches. They're gone. That was a European form that disappeared. And I think that would happen to our church. Let me just tell you one thing that I found out about Hobart, trying to find the good as well as the bad and the ugly, was that he went to Rome and preached a sermon at the English chapel in Rome in 1825, raising money to help the Valdensians survive in Italy. I mean, that's an interesting thing. And I had heard, do any of you know that there's, sorry to go on about this for a moment, but there's a town called Fonda, New York. Do you know about Fonda, New York, which is over close to Utica, I think? And that's where Henry Fonda and Jane Fonda are from, Fonda, New York. And it was an Italian Protestant town in New York. And I thought, oh, Bishop Hobart brought them into the Episcopal Church. I thought, this is another thing I'll find that Bishop Hobart did very well, brought Italians in. Guess what? My wife is Italian, just to let you know. But guess what? It wasn't, they were not ever connected to Hobart. In fact, they didn't like him very much either. So that's another example of that. What about the other question? A very, very good question. What was the impact of the high church having his point of view of not engaging in politics? It meant exactly what Dean Kelly said, that the Episcopal Church House of Bishops, my colleague here and I will both tell you this, never mentioned the word slavery until long after the Civil War. So that, again, the high church was saying, oh, we have to keep our brother bishops in the South and the church. We can't possibly divide the church. And that was a sinful action of our church. I think that was a result of this, let's not get involved in political difficulty. Even the Episcopal Church, I don't think in 1862, meeting in New York City, the General Convention, recognized that a civil war was even going on, I don't think. So why was that? Because again, a part of this Hobartian tradition. So I'm trying to tell the truth, Dean, my colleague and boss, I guess I should say. But I've also tried to tell the good truth, I think, about him too. And I think you've all heard that as well. But we could go on about this, but I think that's probably enough.
And I think that's a very important question, and thank you for that, because part of the mission of Hobart and William Smith colleges is civic engagement. So I want us to really think about the consequences if we are not engaged in politics and our civic responsibilities.
Right.
Dean Douglas, would you like to add in and weigh in on that at all? And before we go to our next question.
Yeah, just to reaffirm what or emphasize what I said earlier, that in the face of injustice, neutrality is not an option. When it comes to the church, and here's where John Jay, the second, part of his critiques of Bishop Hobart and the Episcopal Church and its neutrality when it came to slavery in the Civil War, is he said that they were betraying the gospel. And I agree with him. As I always say, Jesus wasn't crucified because he prayed too much. You know, if you're going, when you have a cross at the center of your faith tradition, it ought to mean something. And what it means is Jesus got on that cross because he, in fact, stood against that which stood in opposition to this more just future that he was embodied, embraced, preached about, etc. And so this is what, speaking from, because we're talking about Hobart, this Christian tradition, John Jay was right. And it seems to me that you have to hold these two things together, not simply an engagement in the political, but how do you prevent it from being what sort of lapsing into white Christian nationalism. You also put that in conversation with this more just future, right? And so there's always this sort of critique on that kind of thing. And so I just affirm that really going to be church, you got to be engaged.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, that's really interesting because it leads into the next question that one of our students is going to pose about what are we doing now? So I want to invite Alex Conradi, who's another member of the Camara Honor Society in the class of 2024.
Hi, so my question is, what efforts are we making to reconcile our relationship with our Haudenosaunee hosts? Is there a scholarship fund, or what are we doing to help out the First Nation people that we have historically not been the best to?
And so I'm going to turn that over to Dean Brophy.
Sure. I'd like to mention a few things that are exactly as you phrased it so nicely, an attempt to reconcile, right? Some are symbolic, but not merely symbolic. Others are shared values and not directly. But if you don't mind, I want to just sort of mention several of them because I think the effort is important. First, Hobart William Smith does offer a presidential scholarship for inclusive excellence that admitted students who've dedicated their efforts to service in diverse communities, or activism in celebrating or promoting communities that are traditionally underrepresented in higher education, which could very well, in this region in particular include activism in support of the First Nations people. Second, Hobart William Smith has taken an active role in the annual commemoration of the Canandaigua Peace Treaty. Like most treaties, it's been violated, but it's still one that the Haudenosaunee and Americans still consider a real, binding kind of treaty, right? And celebrating it and the historical context around it brings to the attention of a lot of people something that they're utterly unaware of. The Hobart and William Smith Dean's offices, this is a third thing, has worked with Seneca and other indigenous scholars and educators to develop the land recognition statement that is now recited before major HWS campus events, which we failed to do so today, in fact. So I'd like to, if you don't mind, point out what it is, okay? And that's, we begin by acknowledging that we were on the traditional territory of the Onondaga, or the people of the Great Hill. In English, they are known as Seneca people, the keeper of the Western Door. They are one of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the world's oldest continual participatory democracy. And again, symbolically, the Haudenosaunee flag also flies during HWS major events, which would have been a nice thing to do. Fourth, our college's strategic diversity plan tries to identify gaps for historically underrepresented identities, including students who identify as Indigenous, coupled with identifying policies, practices, procedures. One of our goals is to not just analyze that data, but to better inform ourselves and challenge our collective beliefs, our perceived notions and stereotypes of, that's the point of it, of underrepresented student identities. So the kind of reconciling you're asking about, and I think it's a fabulous question to be asking, sometimes is pointing to shared values. Let me give you an example. Like the Haudenosaunee, HWS recognizes its responsibility to the environment and is very active in both sustainability and environmental stewardship. It's one of our core notions. It looks like we're on track to be carbon neutral by 2025, and are doing quite a bit with green energy, with composting programs, the real food consumption efforts, and so on. These are, again, I'd point to as shared values worth emphasizing that would go into a kind of reconciling. Just one or two more? Do we have time for about 15% of HWS students are part of the first generation initiative. And this, very often in underrepresented groups, it's very important to get the first generation involved in that way. And finally, my last one or two that I want to point out have to do with our activities in programs like HEOP, like AOP, like the Posse program. Now, again, this is not directly aimed at First Nation people, but it is aimed at the kind of inclusivity that I think goes into the type of reconciling that you've been mentioning. So are we doing enough? No, never. So I'm really glad that students now and students of the future will ask if we are doing enough. And we certainly welcome any ideas, suggestions, or feedback on any of these initiatives. Just send them straight to me.
Thank you so much. I think that one thing we want to remember is that with opportunity programs and many things that we have, this is also connecting back to what Dean Douglas spoke about, how unity must follow justice. And even our Hobart alum, presiding Bishop Michael Curry, has described this as living into the beloved community, where truth-telling is important, where inclusivity is important, and these are values that we hold dear as an institution. So I want to move to our next question, which will be presented by Matthew Messina, a member of Chimera Honor Society, class of 2024. And I will say, Dean Douglas, this is going to be one that I'm going to ask you to weigh in on first.
So my question is, Bishop Hobart was explicit in his belief that the church should remain outside the debate over slavery. In contemporary America, we are faced with discussions revolving around race relations and gender identity. What is the Episcopal Church's position on the inclusion of transgender individuals and the complexities of how people come to understand personal identity?
Yes, thank you, Matthew, for that question. And I'll be brief in respect to our time. The Episcopal Church has traveled a long journey, but has been in the forefront in many respects. And Bishop Bill can speak even more on this in relationship to issues concerning gender inclusion. And when I say gender inclusion, my a priori assumption is that God's creation has never been on any level a binary creation, and that means as well in relationship to gender. And so the Episcopal Church is on its way to catching up with God in this regard. And so it has been very, very inclusive and in this regard, and leading, I think, in terms of Protestant denominations in this country. When we think about the Episcopal Church and its involvement in the worldwide Anglican Communion, the Anglican Communion has not been so inclusive. And I do think that the Episcopal Church has a responsibility to speak boldly to that communion and to lead that communion. And in that regard, I've been disappointed in the Episcopal Church's engagement in that dialogue in trying to lead the church, the Anglican Communion forward, because I think, again, the concern has been for unity and not justice, and further complications in its sort of relationships with certain parts of the communion. But I'll leave it there.
But I would say that definitely Dean Kelly is right that the Episcopal Church does ordain transgender persons. In other words, there's not a barrier in our church to that. And this is a diocesan by diocesan decision, but it is happening. So I would totally agree with what you said. We've been sort of in the forefront of that. And I think that we've been a witness to the Anglican Communion, as you mentioned. Perhaps a louder witness, but still a witness.
Thank you to both. Yes, I am on. Thank you to both of you for that message and for that information about how we have to hold justice at the forefront. And I like what you said, that we are not a binary creation, and we may be trying to catch up as human beings to that understanding. So I want us to move really into the future now, thinking about where we're going with our last question, which will be presented by Jonathan Garcia. And this is a question that he is presenting on behalf of someone who sent it in online.
So our final question is, as a descendant of Bishop John H. Hobart and also of alumni in the classes of 1942, 1968, 1998, and 2021, I wonder what Bishop Hobart might espouse theologically for the future.
Yes, I'd like to ask Bishop Bill if you will answer
Thank you.
that first, and then I'd like to move to Dean Douglas to give your reflections on that theological question.
I would say that what I said in my talk, that Bishop Hobart saw this college as a bulwark on the frontier, surrounded by the burnt over district, in which Christianity could work closely with science. That was part of what he understood Christian humanism to mean. So the college was a place where Christians could be given an education which valued science highly. And you would think, well, that's a no-brainer, but we know in our society right now, it's not a no-brainer. Think of what we went through the COVID time. We had the meeting of the bishops of the Anglican Communion this past summer in Canterbury, England, and you talked about the future. One of the key themes of that meeting, which I think everybody agreed about, was the importance of science and religion working together at this moment. And there was a great deal of discussion of this, and there was an invitation for every national church of the Anglican Communion to have somebody appointed as the bishop for science. I shouldn't be laughing about this, but I think that's a wonderful thing. Our Bishop of Rhode Island has now been appointed as our bishop for science. But I think what that's trying to say, we need to make some symbolic actions for the future because of the creation, what's happening with the creation, all of this. We have to be on the side of a scientific Christianity, a Christianity in which Christianity can learn theologically from science. And Hobart, believe it or not, believed that, and he thought Geneva was a laboratory where that sort of thing should go on. So I think that's something we could say about the heritage of the college that goes way back, but is now pointing to the future in our tradition, for which I think we can be proud. Crusaders for science. I shouldn't use the word crusader.
No, I don't like the word crusader. No.
All right.
Yeah, we'll scratch the
Forget
word
that.
crusader on that one.
That's what I
Bleep
said.
that out.
What do I say? Advocates for science. How about that?
That's
Is that better?
Yes. And I want to say that it's very interesting. A lot of things that were founded with the beginning of Hobart College, thinking about the education of people who identified as Christian, I think laid a groundwork for now how this institution is a place where we see the coming together of such a great diversity of spiritual backgrounds,
Right.
and people who don't really have a identifiable spirituality that they want to bring to the forefront, because many students have many different identities. And I want to make that really clear, that what we're talking about that was at the inception as a way of inclusion of different forms of understanding, quote, Christianity, I believe has evolved into a place where Hobart and William Smith colleges is now a place of inclusion of many different expressions of spirituality and identity. And that's one of the gifts we've received. And as we study this past, let's not forget that it's crouched in these terms of how the college was founded. But it's not necessarily where we are today, but we are continuing, hopefully, to become more and more inclusive as we go along.
Let me just add one thing. I mean, that's something that Hobart was very clear about, that this was not a college just for Episcopalians. And the board was not a board of trustees where there were only Episcopalians. Whereas Columbia University in New York City, only Episcopalians could serve on the board in the 19th century. And the president had to be an Episcopalian. So the college in the 19th century, because of Hobart's views on these things, was much more progressive about that.
Yes, thank you for that. That's a very, very good point. And I think it speaks to the diversity of different understandings of who we are as human beings on this campus today. Dean Douglas, I'd like to get your feedback on what you think Hobart may espouse theologically, and also just anything about, as we close up now, where we're going as a group of people that were founded in this tradition, but we're looking to the future, hopefully, where we are going to one day catch up with the dream of justice.
Yeah, what I can say in terms of Hobart, briefly, is that if indeed he was a man, if you will, as Bishop Franklin has so helped us to understand so well, that really wanted to push the church forward, as he did in relationship to the model he created for our church, which was different from the sort of Anglican model as it was defined by the Church of England. Then I want to take that little inkling in him to hope that that indicates someone who could grow and could listen, and in that regard, perhaps we would hope in this our time he would move even further in his understanding of what it means to be church. And in that regard, in the times in which he would find himself today, though he didn't do it in relationship to slavery, but maybe would find himself believing that the church has to be engaged in the world in a way in which he didn't seem to believe at that time. So let's hope he had that inkling, that sort of theological inkling was there, and so that could be developed even further. My hope, in brief, and for the church, for our church, is that it grows into being church, and that it recognizes itself as church and not simply as a social institution that happens to be religious. And that means that we have the responsibility, as do other faith communities, religious leaders, of expanding our moral imaginary of one, yes, what it means to be church, our moral imaginary of what justice looks like, and leading the way toward justice. And particularly for those of us who gather around the cross, then we have to recognize that to be a part of that movement that led Jesus to the cross means to be a part of a movement that will always stand on the other side of an unjust society, leading us toward justice. And that means that we may find ourselves, well, we will have to bear the cross in whatever way that may look like in our 21st century world.
Thank you so much for that reflection from the perspective of someone who's a dean of a seminary that is in the tradition that's shared with Bishop Hobart, because I think that helps us to understand what some of the shared values that this institution may have with Bishop Hobart and where we are going. But what I want to say is, as we look at those shared values of justice, of how we form a community that is willing to be engaged, how we have dialogue and truth-telling around difficult issues, those are some values that I think transcend any particular faith tradition. And that's what I see happening here this evening with the questions that we have explored with this panel, that I want to thank all of you for serving on this evening, Bishop Franklin, Dean Brophy, Dean Kelly Brown Douglas, and all of our guests here. And I hope this conversation continues, because it has helped us lift up how to find those values of what it means to be truly human, what it means to navigate in the way of love and become a beloved community. As we look around and we see people on this campus who are Jewish, who are Christian, who are Muslim, who are of Asian religions, Hindu, Buddhist, and a lot of indigenous faith practices. But one thing we can come together on is the fact that we look into each other's faces and we understand the value of the person in front of us. We understand the value of the space that we hold, and we understand the value of this place we call home, the environment in which we're a part of. And so I want us to go forward and continue this conversation more this evening. I would like to know if our president has any concluding remarks he'd like to make or anything. We're about to wrap up here, and we'll end with our alma mater.
Oh, good. Go ahead.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to give a special thank you to the people who served on this planning committee, and a couple of people who didn't serve on the planning committee and made a huge difference. And this planning committee did include Chevy Devaney and Bishop Bill Franklin, and Mr. Hadlock also, who's in the Alumni Association, and Teresa Gage and Jackie Baruti, who really did a lot of the logistics and made this possible. Let's please give them a hand. And we would like to conclude now with our alma mater. And thank you so much for coming out this evening. Please stay, meet each other, greet each other, and eat the food that we have over here. And Dean Douglas, thank you so much for joining us from New York City.
It was fun. It was
Champions born of liberty, Hip Hobart, my Hip Hobart, ever shall my champions prove, filled with brave, unchanging love, lifting souls to heights above, Hip Hobart, my Hip Hobart. Raise the orange and purple high, let us shame them never, shout the triumph to the sky, Hip Hobart.